For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat behind that desk on NBC and made it look effortless. He teased his guests, laughed at his own jokes when they bombed, and sent millions of Americans to bed every night feeling like they'd just spent an hour with an old friend. That was the performance. And it was a genuinely great one, but it was a performance. For decades, people close to the show insisted Carson never actually banned anyone. No enemies list, no grudges, just show business. That claim held up for a long time, mostly because Carson himself never confirmed or denied it on the record. But in 2025, a new biography called Love, Johnny Carson, written by longtime Carson researcher Mark Mokoff, cracked that story open. Mokoff spent close to a decade interviewing Carson's producers, writers, and crew, people who'd never talked before, and what they described wasn't a scandal sheet of monsters. It was something more human and, honestly, more interesting. A list of guests who broke rules they didn't know existed, embarrassed him in front of 12 million people, or crossed a line with his staff that he took more personally than almost anything else in his professional life. Carson's own longtime producer, Peter Lassally, confirmed to Mokoff that the list was real. Two other people who worked around Carson for years, Burt Reynolds and Rich Little, both said they'd seen a physical copy of it at some point. According to Mokoff's reporting, it eventually grew to more than 30 names, a mix of A-list movie stars, musicians, and even people who used to sit in Carson's own chair. So let's go through 9 of the most telling names on that real list, and what actually got them there. This is maybe the strangest entry on the list, because Jay Leno eventually became Johnny Carson's successor and hosted The Tonight Show for a combined 22 years. But according to Mokoff's book, there was a period in the late 1970s when Carson quietly wrote Leno off completely. Leno made his Tonight Show debut in March of 1977 and became a semi-regular guest. By February of 1978, on his 5th appearance, something went wrong. The audience response was thin, the laughs were light, and according to Mokoff, that was enough. Carson decided not to invite him back. Lassally is quoted in the book describing Carson's thinking bluntly. Once Johnny decided he didn't like someone's material, that judgment didn't soften over time. It wasn't personal in the sense of a feud. It was closer to a professional verdict that Carson considered final. Obviously, it wasn't permanent. Leno clawed his way back through other bookers and eventually inherited the chair itself in 1992. But for a stretch of the late 70s, one of the most successful comedians in American television history was, by his own eventual boss's private judgment, simply not funny enough for the couch. DeGeneres' case is a little different, because according to Mokoff's reporting, the ban actually came from Tonight Show talent coordinator Jim McCawley rather than from Carson directly, though it stuck all the same. After one of her early appearances, DeGeneres used material McCawley had specifically told her to cut. Rippy Barrett, another staffer, told Mokoff she was in the green room afterward when McCawley confronted DeGeneres in front of the whole room, telling her flatly that he'd warned her not to use that bit. DeGeneres and her guest were asked to leave, with McCawley telling her she wouldn't be invited back anytime soon. That anytime soon turned out to mean years. DeGeneres didn't return to the show until 1989, and even then, it was during a week when Jay Leno was guest hosting, not Carson. It's a small, almost mundane story by daytime television standards. A young comic ignored a note, and it cost her most of a decade on the most important stage in comedy. But it says something about how tightly controlled Carson's show actually was behind the scenes. The rules weren't always Carson's own, but breaking them carried his authority anyway. Shatner appeared on The Tonight Show roughly 10 times between 1963 and 1983. His last appearance with Carson himself, in February of 1983, ended the relationship for good, and according to Mokoff, it wasn't one mistake, it was 3. First, Shatner reportedly launched into an answer and just kept going, talking for about 4 minutes essentially uninterrupted. Then, mid-show, he turned away from Carson to talk directly to fellow guest Buddy Hackett, a move that read on camera as sidelining the host on his own show. And finally, he mentioned that his series T.J. Hooker was airing on ABC, which violated an unwritten Tonight Show rule. Guests could plug their other projects, but never the name of a rival network. NBC's engineers actually muted the word ABC when the episode aired. Shatner apparently had no idea any of this had happened until years later. He continued showing up on Tonight Show episodes hosted by guest hosts like Patrick Duffy and Jay Leno, but never again with Carson behind the desk. In a 2011 memoir, Shatner offered his own theory, that he'd simply talked too much, and later told USA Today he didn't understand why Carson would, in his words, develop a grudge against certain people and just never explain why. Of everyone on this list, Sagan's fall from grace is probably the most poignant, because by 1986 he and Carson weren't just host and guest, they had a real rapport built over roughly 24 appearances stretching back years. Sagan's charisma on the show helped make him one of the most recognizable scientists in America. Then, in January 1986, during a conversation about the return of Halley's Comet, Sagan corrected Carson's facts, not once, but twice, on air. According to Markoff's account, Carson smoothed over the moment in the broadcast with his usual easy charm, but privately, he felt undercut. Sagan never appeared on the show with Carson again. It's a small moment by any objective measure, a scientist correcting an inaccuracy about a comet, but it captures something real about Carson's temperament. He could be publicly gracious about being wrong and privately unable to let it go. Wells is one of the more layered entries, because Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was a genuinely serious amateur magician, respected enough in magic circles that he understood the craft's actual ethics. That's part of why what Wells did offended him so specifically. During a Tonight Show appearance built around a magic act, Wells reportedly used audience plants, people secretly placed in the crowd ahead of time to fake a spontaneous trick. To most viewers, this would be an unremarkable bit of stagecraft. To Carson, according to Markoff, it was a breach of honesty with the audience, and he was genuinely angry about it. A magician using plants, Markoff writes, was something Carson considered inexcusable. Wells didn't return to the show with Carson again. It's worth noting Wells also shows up in other Tonight Show band, reporting for the same underlying reason. Carson's very specific, very personal code about honesty in magic, which he held guests to more strictly than almost any other rule on the show. This is the one with the highest stakes of anyone on the list, because according to Markoff's reporting, it may have played a direct role in ending Carson's 30-year run. Carvey had been doing Carson impressions on Saturday Night Live for years, something Carson reportedly tolerated even though he wasn't a fan of the show generally. But in May of 1991, SNL aired a sketch nicknamed Carsenio, in which Carvey played Carson as out of touch and washed up, essentially channeling rival host Arsenio Hall while mocking his own show's relevance. Leno, who was a guest the night word got around about the upcoming sketch, later told Markoff he overheard Carson in a hallway saying that if they were going to keep making fun of him, it was time to go. 5 days after the sketch aired, Carson announced he was stepping down. His final broadcast came the following May, in 1992. Whether the sketch was truly the deciding factor or simply the final straw after years of accumulated network pressure and SNL mockery is something only Carson really knew. But according to those closest to him, Carvey was permanently frozen out after that broadcast, and Carson's own monologue jokes about getting senile in the days after strongly suggest the wound was real. Streisand's case is simpler than most. In 1975, she was scheduled to appear on the show and canceled at the last minute, reportedly without giving Carson or his staff a clear reason. Carson, who prided himself on running a tight, professional operation, told his audience the next night that she'd pulled out with no explanation given. She didn't return to the show during the rest of Carson's tenure, though she has since appeared with later hosts, including Jimmy Fallon. It's one of the more low-drama entries on the list, but it's a good example of how little Carson actually needed to permanently write someone off. No blow-up, no on-air confrontation, just an unreturned professional courtesy that he apparently never forgot. Of every name connected to Carson, Rivers is the one whose falling out became genuinely public, and it's also the one Carson himself seemed unable to move past for the rest of his life. Rivers had been a Tonight Show regular since 1965, and Carson championed her career for 2 decades. She was his most frequent guest host, the person NBC turned to whenever Carson needed time off. Then in 1986, Fox offered Rivers her own late-night show to compete directly against Carson's. According to Rivers's own account, given years later in the documentary Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, Carson found out about the deal from network sources, not from her directly. She tried calling him afterward to explain and smooth things over. He hung up on her. By her account, he never spoke to her again for the rest of his life, a period spanning almost 2 decades until Carson's death in 2005. Rivers later said she regretted not asking for his blessing before signing the deal, but the damage was done. In Carson's eyes, this wasn't a career move, it was a betrayal by someone he'd personally built up. Not every name on Carson's list came from an on-air gaffe. According to Markoff's reporting, musician Jerry Lee Lewis was frozen out for behavior toward the show's crew, the specific behind-the-scenes offense that Carson, by every account from people who worked with him, treated as close to unforgivable. Malkoff writes plainly that Carson did not tolerate guests who disrespected his staff, regardless of how famous they were. Lewis's case is thinner on detail than some of the others. Malkoff doesn't spell out the exact incident in the reporting that circulated publicly, but the pattern lines up with the same principle that shows up again and again across the list. Carson would forgive almost anything done to him personally. He was far less forgiving of anything done to the people working under him. Put together, these 9 stories don't add up to a portrait of hidden monsters. They add up to something more specific, a picture of exactly what Johnny Carson considered unforgivable. Being unfunny wasn't fatal. Carson gave people second and third chances on that front constantly. What actually got you permanently frozen out was embarrassing him on his own stage, breaking a rule of his show, written or not, being dishonest with his audience, or treating his crew with disrespect. Betraying his trust, as Rivers did in his eyes, was apparently the only offense on this list Carson never recovered from personally. None of that makes Carson a villain, and none of it makes the guests on this list evil, whatever the algorithm bait title might promise. It makes for something more useful, honestly, a rare, well-documented look at what actually went on behind the most polished desk in American television, from a host who spent 30 years making it look like nothing behind that desk ever ruffled him at all. Sources: Mark Malkoff and David Ritz. Love, Johnny Carson. One Obsessive Fan's Journey to Find the Genius Behind the Legend, 2025. Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, documentary. Contemporary reporting from Fox News, Parade, and USA Today on Malkoff's book.